And we're back. You know, I've been looking forward to this portion of our get-together for quite some time. Our guest is Jane Johansson. Jane, welcome. It's good to have you here.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
You teach history at the Pryor campus, don't you?
Yes, I'm a professor of history here at Rogers State University, and I office at the Pryor campus. I've been associated with the Pryor campus since about the mid-1990s.
You are responsible, and I'm going to hold this up. I'm not sure which camera wants to get it. You guys will have to direct me, but it's Albert Ellithorpe, the first Indian Home Guards in the Civil War. This is the book. Where do you want me? Over there? Okay. That you wrote. When I finished reading it, I was astounded because there was almost a third more in back, full of nothing but references. You really did your research on this.
I love to do research.
Do you really?
Yes.
How long did it take you to put this together?
I'd say from start to finish in approximately 3 years. I was not working full-time on it during the whole time period. In the fall of 2014, Rogers State awarded me a one-semester sabbatical. So I was relieved of all of my teaching responsibilities, and I could work full-time on it. So that semester is when I really got the book put together. I got everything divided into chapters, and I finished up my research during that time period. Basically wrote the first draft of the book in that time.
The Home Guard is what?
The 5 civilized tribes, which today we usually just refer to as the 5 tribes, they all allied with the Confederacy. But 3 of those tribes were internally divided, the Cherokee and also the Muskogee Creek and the Seminole. They were divided in their loyalties. And so
quite divided, were they not?
Quite divided. And very early in the war, a group of loyal Muskogee Creeks, that is loyal to the Union, were driven out of the Indian Territory into Kansas. And so they became refugees in Kansas. That's where the first Indian Home Guards was created. It was made up of refugees from the Indian Territory. Muskogee Creeks, Seminoles, and about 30 African Creeks, men who had been enslaved in the Indian Territory.
So the Home Guard then would have been aligned with the Confederacy?
No, this is Union.
With Union? Okay.
Right. And there would be 3 regiments of Home Guards. First, Indian Home Guards, second and third. The second and third regiments were primarily made up of Cherokee Indians.
So essentially, the Indian tribes suffered virtually the very same thing that non-Indian people did, in that it divided families, it divided friends, and feelings ran deep and stayed there.
Yes.
For generations.
Yes.
I got the distinct impression from reading your book, and it's the first time this has ever jumped out to grab me, that there was a period in our history of the Civil War when commissions for officers were almost bartered, where one officer could write a letter to a commander about a lieutenant, about a sergeant or a corporal, and that person might come out a captain or a lieutenant colonel. I had no idea that sort of attitude existed.
Some of these commissions were very political. Albert Ellithorpe probably became an officer because of his political connections. Also, men in many units were allowed the privilege of electing officers. So obviously there's a political dynamic there as well. Some of these officers turned out to be outstanding. Others, as you can well imagine, turned out to be poor choices.
Let's go back with him, if we could, just for a bit. He had quite a checkered past. newspaperman, teacher. He did all kinds of things, kind of a jack at all trades and very good at all of them, and became interested then in the military, particularly when he saw that there were forces opposed to what he believed in. And I mean, he stepped up.
Yes.
It cost him a lot, though, didn't it?
It did. In some ways. He was really an adventurer, is my perspective on him. Before the war, he'd been in the California Gold Rush. He'd been in the Colorado Gold Rush, too. As you mentioned, strong interest in politics. He was an abolitionist. I'm not quite sure where he fell on the abolitionist spectrum. But yes, he became intensely interested in enlisting and supporting the Union cause, which he was, as you could tell from his writings, very loyal to. He didn't actually serve in the war all that long, at least not on active duty very long. And unfortunately, he didn't leave any post-war accounts of his feelings about his service in the war. I got the impression he's very proud of his service.
And going back again to, before the war, he, as I said, worked in newspaper business for a while, and he also started a newspaper in Chicago, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
And what's intriguing, the way this is laid out, Chicago in the day was really a small town. It wasn't a big swinging town like it is now.
Right, when he moved there, it was just a village.
Yeah.
In the 1830s.
And all of a sudden, boom. It just exploded, people from everywhere. It's also interesting, and I got the sense from your book of the traveling bands of marauders, if you will.
Yes.
Everybody sort of thinks of John Brown, or they think of Quantrill, but there were others. And you don't hear quite as much about them, and some of them are just professional troublemakers that would go in and rob and hot-footed on out of the woods.
Yeah, some of them were opportunists. The guerrilla leader that Ellithorpe had the most trouble with was Thomas Livingston, who had a guerrilla band in southwest Missouri. And Ellithorpe and his men encountered Livingston quite a bit in early 1863.
I don't think Livingston took him all that seriously at first, did he?
Perhaps not.
Because he just kept coming back. Sort of interesting. There was a fellow, and I mentioned this to you earlier, Stan Wadey, who made the last raid at Cabin Creek. And not a lot of folks know this, but over here by Sand Springs, I'm sure you know, there are still wagon marks in the rocks where people can go and literally put their hands in what were the wagon tracks where he made his retreat at one point after the raid at Cabin Creek.
Yes, that's right.
And I find that interesting, that it's still with us.
Yes, and Ellithorpe referred to Stan Wadey on a number of occasions. I don't believe Ellithorpe ever directly confronted Stan Wadey, but he was always hearing about him. He was always out there somewhere, making raids and launching various attacks. So Stan Wadey was a very active guerrilla leader.
Some of these guys that were involved, and we're talking guerrilla warfare here, some of these guys were innovative in their approach to warfare, would steal the uniforms for the other side and go riding right up as close as possible to an encampment and open fire, and then they're gone again. The woods would just swallow them up.
Yes.
Did you ever catch yourself as a writer and research person trying to see the world through his eyes?
Yes, I did. What's fascinating to me is he had no military experience before the Civil War, and all of a sudden he's thrust into a leadership position in a regiment made up of refugee Indians. And he had to just learn on the fly. And very early in his personal journal, he talks about leading his men toward a Confederate encampment along the Arkansas River. And he explains very specifically how he had the men stand about 100 yards apart, and then they made an advance toward the river, and they observed the enemy across the river very carefully, and then they advance, do the next part, cross the river. Mm-hmm. And no one taught him that.
It's reminiscent, if you will, of when we fought the British. Mm-hmm. Because the British it was so ingrained for the line up, straight line, close together, close quarters, open fire. And the boys and girls that were over here were coming out of the woods, and they knew the more distance between one another, the better. You could hide in trees, behind rocks, and do more damage. Fewer men could do more damage than 3 or 4 lines of the British coming at them. So they, again, were learning on the fly. The British took that message back and said, what are we doing wrong?
Although an interesting thing about that is George Washington eventually had his men trained to fight more like the British.
Mm-hmm. Oh my goodness, yeah, we can get into a whole area here of warfare.
Right.
And also battlefield music, which is something else. Mm-hmm. I'll share with you when we get off, but there's a whole chapter or a book or a number of books written about music on the battlefield. But Albert, what happened after the war? Where did he end up?
Albert returns to Chicago after the war, and he becomes involved in a number of business ventures. He, for example, ends up collecting rents, and he becomes involved in a sex scandal after the war, which will be documented by the Chicago Tribune. But the most interesting thing to me is that he ends up inventing several safety features for the elevator. After the Chicago fire in 1871, downtown Chicago was rebuilt, and a number of very talented architects arrived in Chicago, and they constructed skyscrapers. You can't have a skyscraper without an elevator.
Let me reference something she just pointed out, because this really was an intriguing part of the book. Back in the day, when elevators were up and down, there were no brakes. They didn't have an elevator brake like you're used to now. So Albert discovered that in a closed room or a closed box-like setting, when that car came down, air pressure made a difference on the speed of the car. And he got to thinking about it, and from there came not the air brake that Mr. Westinghouse promoted, but air brake of sorts.
Yes.
And he did all these grandiose experiments, like he'd put out fine china and crates of eggs, and in one case was it his son in a chair, and they cut the rope.
Yes, and sometimes thousands of people would be witness to these.
Yeah, and no eggs broken, no glasses broken, no plates.
Yes.
But the son got some.
Yes, the son ends up dying as a result of an accident. He was seated on a chair, the chair broke, and part of the chair leg went into his leg and cut an artery, and he ends up dying as a result.
We're out of time. Will you come back?
I'd love to.
I'd love to have you back. Thank you very much, and
Thank you.
Thanks for the great work you've done with this book. That's all the time we have. We'll see you back next time on Perspectives.